Hong Kong, July 1972. Golden Harvest Studios. 7 people were in the auxiliary rehearsal room behind stage 3. They were not scheduled to be there. Bruce Lee was preparing to film a scene for Enter the Dragon. The lighting crew had finished adjustments. A stunt coordinator waited with a clipboard near the door. Production assistant Raymond Chow Jr. would later say the air in that hallway felt compressed, as if something private was unfolding inside a public building. Bruce never spoke publicly about what happened in that room. But 3 of the men who witnessed it gave partial accounts years later. Their stories align on one point: a challenge was issued, not for cameras, not for publicity, but for pride. The challenger was not an extra. He was not a fan. He had credentials, scars, and something to prove. 7 seconds after the first contact, the mood in the room changed permanently. No one cheered. One man could not stand upright afterward. And Bruce Lee, already famous, already controversial, walked out of that room visibly shaken. The method was never filmed. The details were never announced. But the witnesses remembered the sound. And they remembered the choice he made at the end. Hong Kong, July 1972. Bruce Lee had just returned from a brief stint in Los Angeles, where he had begun negotiating Enter the Dragon. He was 31, lean, taut, and carrying a reputation that preceded him in ways both useful and dangerous. The city buzzed with rumor. Martial arts schools whispered about the new style that ignored tradition yet executed strikes with unerring precision. Bruce was no longer just a film actor, he was a polarizing figure in the martial arts community itself. At this point, his previous films, The Big Boss and Fist of Fury, had secured his star power, but the victories on screen did not translate into universal respect. Traditionalists saw his methods as reckless, a blending of systems that violated centuries-old codes. Even among contemporaries who respected his skill, there were murmurs. He was fast, yes, but did speed equate to mastery? Could he withstand someone trained for real, unchoreographed confrontation? The tension was not abstract. Crew members and visiting masters recalled stopping by studios, ostensibly to observe choreography, but in reality, to gauge the man behind the legend. Some asked about sparring routines. Others simply watched Bruce move, noting the acceleration in his strikes and the subtle shifts in his stance. There was an unspoken question in every glance: would he falter if faced with a live, uncompromising opponent? Bruce understood the stakes, and they were layered. His reputation in Hong Kong could carry him internationally, but it could also unravel in a single misjudged encounter. To refuse a challenge would suggest fear or inadequacy. To accept and fail would confirm the worst suspicions of his detractors. And yet, Bruce was drawn to confrontation in a way few outside martial arts circles could comprehend. Not for ego. Not for spectacle. For clarity, to know exactly what his body and mind were capable of under real conditions. The rehearsal rooms at Golden Harvest were already steeped in tension that day. Preparations for filming meant the space was technically a professional environment, but that afternoon, it became a testing ground removed from cameras, scripts, and audiences. Only a handful of crew were present: lighting technicians, a stunt coordinator, and Raymond Chow Jr., the production assistant who would later recount the incident in fragments. The air, according to Chow, felt compressed, like it was waiting for something to happen. Bruce's recent work in film had made him a star, but it had also made him a target for scrutiny from all sides. He was celebrated, yet he was controversial. The martial arts world was fractious, divided between traditionalists who valued lineage and technique, and modernists who valued efficiency and adaptability. Bruce occupied the middle ground, admired by some, feared by others, and distrusted by those unwilling to acknowledge that someone could innovate without disrespecting the craft. This context is essential. The challenge that would unfold in that small room was not a publicity stunt, nor a casual sparring session. It was a confrontation steeped in expectation, history, and risk. Bruce was entering an encounter where every misstep would echo, professionally, socially, and personally. The stage was set. The rules were few. The stakes were clear: prove skill, survive scrutiny, and confront the limits of one's own capacity for controlled violence. The man who entered the rehearsal room that afternoon was identified by 3 witnesses years later as Master Liang, though some accounts suggested he traveled under different names depending on which school he represented. He was in his late 30s, with a compact, muscular frame, approximately 5 feet 9 inches and weighing around 165 pounds, but his strength was deceptive. Witnesses later recalled noticing the hard, scarred surface along his knuckles, remnants of years fighting bare-knuckle bouts, and a faint line across his left eyebrow, evidence of past facial trauma. He carried himself with the calm posture of someone who had never been surprised in combat. Liang's reputation was partially documented. He had competed in full-contact tournaments in Taiwan, where rules were minimal, and referees rarely intervened. He had trained in northern styles that emphasized explosive strikes, joint control, and close-quarter manipulation, techniques that did not translate easily to choreographed film work. To those present in the room, his skill was credible not because of size or celebrity, but because of visible, tangible proof. His movements were economical, precise, and potentially lethal. He had heard the claims about Bruce Lee. Claims of stopping kicks mid-flight. Claims of breaking boards in ways that defied conventional timing. Claims that Bruce could intercept strikes inches from impact without apparent effort. For Liang, those claims were a challenge. Not a challenge for public validation, but a test of reality. Witness Tony Liu, the stunt coordinator, later recalled Liang whispering under his breath, "There is truth in skill, and there is truth in flesh. Let us see which remains." Liang was dangerous because he did not underestimate Bruce. Most opponents, when faced with Bruce's reputation, either held back or attempted to overcompensate. Liang approached without arrogance or hesitation. He understood the stakes. He understood that a single misjudgment could leave him injured, or worse, but he had experience in precisely these conditions: small, confined spaces, real strikes, no padding, no cameras. He knew how to exploit human vulnerabilities. He was also strategic. Liang did not rush, he observed. He tested distance, probed defenses with subtle feints, and adjusted his angles constantly. Witness Raymond Chow Jr. remembered thinking that Liang's eyes never left Bruce's movement, but never stared either. They measured, calculating. It is critical to understand, Liang's presence was not intended to humiliate Bruce. There was no spectacle, no cheering, no theatrics. This was a private confrontation, stripped of the artificial safety nets that film sets provide. The stakes were authenticity. Each man carried the knowledge that a misstep could result in real damage, broken ribs, facial trauma, or at the very least, humiliation that would ripple through the martial arts community. This was the first time Bruce faced an opponent who did not flinch, who did not perform for the cameras, and who could meet him blow for blow in real time. Liang's credibility, coupled with his calm, measured threat, immediately elevated the encounter from routine rehearsal to a psychologically charged crucible. The stage was set not just for a physical test, but for a confrontation that would probe Bruce's judgment, restraint, and awareness under genuine danger. The rehearsal room at Golden Harvest Studios was modest, roughly 20 by 30 feet, with polished wood flooring that had been scuffed by years of practice sessions and stunt drills. One wall was mirrored, reflecting the figures of the men inside but offering no concealment of their movements. Fluorescent lights overhead cast a stark glare, leaving no shadow to hide a strike or a shift in posture. For anyone entering this space, it was a room stripped of distractions, almost clinical in its simplicity, yet charged with the kind of tension that only comes from anticipating real contact. 7 men were present that afternoon, all standing along the walls to observe. There was Raymond Chow Jr., the production assistant, whose notes decades later described the atmosphere as compressed, heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. Tony Liu, the stunt coordinator, stood near the door, his arms crossed, watching intently. The others were lighting technicians, present only because the room had been previously reserved for film rehearsal, and they were inadvertently drawn into the encounter. None of them spoke. None would intervene unless it became a medical emergency. There were no formal rules. Bruce Lee and Master Liang had agreed to a single principle: controlled contact, authentic engagement, but no predetermined choreography. There would be no protective gear, no gloves, no mat to cushion falls. No one was keeping time, and no one would signal when the bout ended. It was understood, tacitly, that this was not a staged demonstration. Bruce had removed his warm-up jacket, leaving only a tight t-shirt that revealed the taut musculature along his chest and arms. He flexed his hands subtly, fingers curling and relaxing in preparation. Liang had stretched his wrists once and then stopped, his breathing steady and deliberate. Witnesses later noted that he moved as though the room were empty, even though all eyes were fixed on him. There was no bow, no ceremonial gesture. The confrontation was already a test of focus, patience, and nerves. The emotional atmosphere was taut but controlled. There was curiosity, yes, and concern. Yet it was underscored by a palpable recognition of danger. The men on the sidelines instinctively shifted to the edges of the room, out of reach, as if gravity itself was drawing them back from the center where the encounter would unfold. The silence carried its own pressure, each tick of the second hand amplified by the knowledge that no safety net existed. The door to the room was locked from the inside, preventing interruption. A small window near the ceiling let in faint sunlight, but it did little to relieve the tension. The smell of sweat, dust, and linseed oil from the floor mingled with the faint metallic scent of anticipation. It was a rare configuration: two highly skilled fighters, one room, and witnesses unable to intervene. The conditions themselves became a participant in the encounter. Every movement, every step, every adjustment had consequences. Distance, timing, and leverage would be measured precisely, and there was no margin for error. Witness Tony Liu would later reflect, it wasn't just about skill. It was about judgment under pressure. The room made you realize how small errors could turn real, how quickly respect and control could be lost. The stage was set, a confined space, no rules except authenticity, witnesses who could not help, and a quiet awareness that any strike could have serious consequences. Every factor combined to amplify the psychological stakes even before the first contact. The distance between Bruce Lee and Master Liang began at roughly 6 feet, measured instinctively rather than formally. Both men stood in low, balanced stances, eyes locked. There was no flourish, no demonstration for the witnesses. Every subtle movement mattered. Bruce's shoulders tensed, forearms flexed, and the slightest rotation of his hips suggested readiness. Liang shifted his weight, grounding himself in a posture honed by years of unpadded combat. The first move came from Liang, a probing low kick aimed at Bruce's lead leg. It was not full power, but it was precise enough to test timing and reflex. Bruce's reaction was instantaneous. His rear foot pivoted, his right hand parried downward just enough to redirect the strike while maintaining balance. Witnesses described the motion as fluid, but measured, noting that the interception was so precise it bordered on imperceptible. Bruce immediately countered with a straight lead aimed toward Liang's face. The fist traveled rapidly, yet with control, stopping just short of impact, a fraction of an inch from Liang's nose. Tony Liu later recalled that even in that brief moment, the room's tension tightened, you could hear the air move around him. It wasn't fast for show, it was fast for survival. Liang's eyes flicked at the incoming strike, adjusting subtly, shifting his angle to avoid the punch without retreating. Liang's next maneuver escalated the encounter. He closed distance abruptly, stepping into Bruce's space with a forward burst designed to destabilize. It was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No spinning kicks, no exaggerated leaps. Just short, sharp contact, shoulder against shoulder, forearm brushing chest, shoes scraping the wooden floor as momentum pressed forward. Bruce absorbed the impact, his knees bending to maintain balance, his core engaged in a controlled counterweight. Witnesses noticed a subtle shift at this point. For the first time, Bruce appeared to absorb pressure rather than dictate it. Liang's forward drive created a psychological edge, forcing Bruce to react under genuine threat. Even the small crack of the floorboards underfoot seemed amplified in the charged silence. Bruce's breathing remained controlled, but his chest rose slightly faster than before, a sign of physical exertion meeting cognitive focus. The exchange was short, almost imperceptible in the span of time, but its implications were clear. Bruce adjusted his stance, angling slightly to his left, bringing his rear leg into a supportive base. Liang probed again with a quick jab to the solar plexus, not to land fully, but to test distance, timing, and Bruce's response. Bruce deflected, creating minimal contact, his hands tracking Liang's movement like a finely tuned instrument. The witnesses recalled the rhythm of the encounter as compressed, precise, and dangerous. Each man was testing the other, reading subtle cues, shifts in weight, micro-rotations of the torso, the tension in the shoulders, the line of sight in the eyes. There was no room for error. One misstep could result in an actual strike landing. By the end of the first exchange, the psychological undercurrent had shifted. Bruce was no longer simply demonstrating his skill. He was measuring the limits of a real opponent in real time. Liang had pressed forward, compressed the space, and forced Bruce into reactive engagement, and Bruce, for the first time that afternoon, was forced to recalibrate under authentic pressure. The stage was set for escalation. The distance had closed. The room had grown smaller. Every observer in the room understood that the encounter was no longer theoretical. Real contact, real consequence, was imminent. The space between Bruce Lee and Master Liang had shrunk to mere inches. By now, both men were fully engaged in close-quarters combat, a controlled clash stripped of theatrics. Every movement carried consequence. Bruce's breathing was audible, a subtle rhythm under the tension of exertion, while Liang remained deceptively calm, his eyes fixed, calculating angles and weight distribution with surgical precision. Liang initiated the next sequence with a sharp forearm strike to Bruce's collarbone. It landed with enough force to jar the muscles and make the shoulder recoil, though Bruce absorbed it without losing balance. A follow-up knee grazed his thigh, a glancing impact that demonstrated not only Liang's control but the very real danger of proximity in a confined space. Witnesses later recalled hearing the faint thump of flesh against flesh, the friction of wood beneath their shoes, and Bruce's suppressed intake of breath, all signals that this was no rehearsal. The fight compressed further. Bruce's range of motion was limited, forcing him to rely on precision rather than sweeping strikes. Short, sharp movements dominated, elbows, wrist manipulations, brief but decisive pushes against joints. Liang's attacks were angled to test Bruce's capacity for control, probing vulnerabilities with minimal yet effective contact. It was a chess match at high speed, every micro-adjustment shifting the balance of power in fractions of a second. Then came the moment of moral choice, the fulcrum of the encounter. Bruce found himself in a position of potential dominance. He trapped Liang's lead arm against his torso, securing a slight leverage advantage. In a fraction of a second, Bruce could have delivered a vertical strike to Liang's solar plexus with full commitment. Physiologically, the impact could have doubled Liang over, potentially breaking ribs or forcing the wind from his lungs completely. Bruce's eyes tightened. His body coiled, ready. The room seemed to pause. Witness Raymond Chow Jr. later recalled the precise second when Bruce's hand extended and then abruptly halted mid-motion. He described it as a moment where Bruce's internal calculation overrode raw capability, the recognition that mastery was not measured solely by how much damage could be inflicted, but by restraint under extreme conditions. Liang, momentarily trapped, looked up, his expression neutral yet alert. Bruce held the position, aware that his next movement could end the engagement violently or leave Liang intact. The choice weighed on him. Physical skill had brought him to this apex, but moral control, psychological composure, and long-term consequences dictated the action. He retracted his fist, easing the pressure, and shifted backward to reset the space between them. Liang, still upright, exhaled audibly, recovering the air forced from his chest in the prior engagement. Neither man spoke. The witnesses, who had watched tensely from the periphery, felt the sudden release of psychological pressure, yet the room remained charged. Everyone present sensed the gravity of what had just been avoided, not defeat, but controlled danger, proof of skill and judgment intertwined. This was the defining moment. Bruce had been pushed to the edge, forced to confront not only an opponent capable of real harm but also his own potential to inflict it. The danger was tangible, the stakes psychological as well as physical, and the decision left a residual weight in the room. Even as Bruce moved to a neutral stance, the subtle crack in composure remained visible, a jaw tightness, a microtwitch in the forearm, a brief pause in breathing. He had proven dominance without destruction, skill without ruin. By the end of this exchange, the encounter had achieved its psychological apex. Bruce's restraint became as significant as his ability to strike, and every observer present understood that what they had witnessed was more than a demonstration, it was a controlled confrontation with human consequence at every moment. The peak of danger and psychological stakes is now fully realized, with Bruce facing a tangible moral and physical decision. When the final motion settled, the room remained silent. Master Liang recovered first, though slowly, his posture still controlled but slightly bent from the compressed exchanges. Bruce Lee stepped back, chest rising and falling steadily, yet there was a weight in his gaze that the witnesses would not forget. No one applauded. No one spoke. The rehearsal room, now only 20 by 30 feet of polished wood and mirrors, felt both smaller and heavier than before. Liang did not offer a handshake. He merely adjusted his stance, exhaled deliberately, and stepped aside. The confrontation had ended without fanfare, without victory in the conventional sense, but with clarity. Both men had tested the boundaries of skill, speed, and judgment, and both had emerged intact. Yet the psychological residue remained. Witness Raymond Chow Jr. would later say, "You could feel Bruce carrying something heavier than exhaustion." He wasn't hurt, not physically, but he had been made aware of the weight of his own capacity for harm. Bruce remained seated on the edge of a bench for several minutes, staring at his hands, flexing and relaxing the fingers slowly. Crew members noticed the subtle tension in his forearms, the way his shoulders shifted even at rest, and the quiet, almost imperceptible strain in his jaw. It was not fatigue alone that held him there. It was the confrontation with control itself, the realization that skill could be lethal in seconds, that speed and precision were not neutral tools, and that mastery required conscious restraint. In the days and weeks following, the event shaped Bruce's approach to training and instruction. While his public demonstrations and film choreography emphasized speed and fluidity, he increasingly incorporated lessons on judgment, distance, and stopping short of full impact. Those closest to him observed subtle changes, a deeper attention to student safety, a more deliberate pacing in sparring sessions, and an acknowledgement, in private, of the psychological strain inherent in real combat. For the witnesses, the encounter was indelible. Tony Liu, the stunt coordinator, recalled that the room had felt like it held its breath for those 7 seconds of decisive movement. Raymond Chow Jr. described it as a moment when you could see skill and restraint as separate things, and understand that one could exist without the other. These impressions persisted long after the day's filming resumed, shaping how each would later describe Bruce Lee not as a mythical figure, but as a human confronting genuine danger. The encounter also altered the narrative surrounding Bruce in martial arts circles. Those who doubted his claims of speed and control were forced to acknowledge the precision he could bring under duress. Yet the story remained largely hidden, never publicized in studios or newspapers. It lived instead in quiet testimony, fragmented accounts, and the recollections of those who had seen the event unfold. One crew member would later reflect in writing, "The strongest man in the room is not the one who wins. It's the one who knows exactly how much damage he chose not to do." Bruce walked from the rehearsal room that afternoon carrying more than the sweat and exertion of a private confrontation. He carried knowledge of his own limits, an awareness of human vulnerability, and the weight of choice, a quiet, dangerous understanding that would inform every strike he ever delivered. The room returned to routine. Lights were adjusted. Cameras prepared. Yet the memory of what happened in those 7 seconds lingered, unspoken but palpable, a testament to control, precision, and the subtle power of restraint.